Alfred Denker was born in 1960 in Amsterdam. He studied philosophy, theology and history at the universities of Groningen and Amsterdam, receiving his PhD in 1997. From 1988 until 2006, he was the director of Centre Philosophique Les Trois Hiboux in Pont-de-Sirou, France. Since 2004, he's been co-editor with Holger Zaborowski of the Heidegger Jahrbuch. Since 2006, he has been the director of the Martin Heidegger Archive in Germany. Since 2008, he has been the co-editor with Holger Zaborowski of the Martin Heidegger Briefausgabe. From 2009 into 2011, he was the director of Philoart in Normandy, France. Since 2013, he has been the director of the Heidegger Museum in Germany. Since 2020, he has been co-editor of Annuario Heidegger. In 2022, he founded the Centro des Estudios Heideggerianos and the Place for Another Kind of Thinking and Dwelling, where this conversation took place. Alfred has a Patreon account and regularly holds lectures and reading groups via Zoom and in person on Heidegger's life and thought. Please consider supporting his work by becoming a Patreon. The link is in the description.
Well, maybe the best way to start is to present some of my thoughts on Heidegger, the way we can work philosophically with Heidegger, the importance of his thinking for us today. And from there it unfolds into all these different things that I'm doing. When I was 15, I was on a holiday with my family in Greece, on the Isle of Corfu. And I would do a lot of walking and sitting on rocks and staring out over the sea. And then I decided that I wanted to become a wise person. And if you want to become wise, you're supposed to do philosophy. So, of course, the goal of philosophy is to become wise, but you will never arrive at that point. It's the same with Novalis saying that philosophy is basically nostalgia, the desire to be at home everywhere. Well, I don't think a human being can be at home everywhere, but you can try to be at home as much as possible. So, of course, it was easy for me to decide to go study philosophy. I was in the fortunate position that for a while at high school, we had a teacher of German who was also doing a doctorate in philosophy, and he gave philosophy classes, and he started talking about German philosophy, and also Heidegger came up. But to be honest, in the beginning, I read Heidegger in English, but I taught myself how to read it in German and write in German, so at some point, I think it's important if you do philosophy to make a choice and say, well, I want to specialize or focus on one thinker in particular and try to understand that thinker as deeply and as broadly as I can. I hesitated between Schelling and Heidegger. I wanted to do a modern philosophy and not medieval, ancient philosophy, because it's so far away from who we are today. And of course, at that time, I didn't understand things as I might understand them now, but I think it was the right choice. And in the end, I decided that Heidegger could be of great importance if you wanted to understand yourself, the time you live in. So Heidegger is a philosopher of the 20th century. When he was born, there was still a German Empire. He lived through the First World War, he lived through the Nazi period in the Second World War, and in his old days he still got a landing on the moon and television and cars and airplanes, so he lived through basically all the stuff that is still, in one way or another, determining who we are today. So to come to better self-understanding, you have to understand the 20th century. And for me, a part of the 20th century is also the horror of the 20th century. It's easy to get away from it if you focus on Schelling, because there's no Second World War in Schelling or in Aristotle. But if you want to just get some kind of grip on how this was possible, the Holocaust and everything connected to it, then I think it's important. to look at a philosopher who can help you in that respect. I was also attracted to Heidegger's writing, although it's a peculiar kind of writing and it takes some getting used to. But once you get the feel and you understand a little bit how he's writing, I think he often writes very beautiful texts and meaningful texts. So there's a little in Heidegger which is worthless and interesting. As a counterexample, I can't read Jaspers. I find him totally boring and he doesn't speak to me. And I think that's something I always say to people who want to do philosophy: find a philosopher who speaks to you. And if it doesn't speak to you, don't bother. And it's, in a sense, that also goes for seminars. It's more important that you get something from it that speaks to you than you try to repeat what somebody has been telling you about a philosopher. So it's often just this one moment in a week of studying or in a conference. There's just the one line that sticks with you and that can help you understanding your own life better or understand the philosopher better, things like that. Well, if you think about philosophy, then you learn how to think from what they call the great thinkers. And then, of course, the next question is, who is a great thinker? How do you determine that? I think if you look at the 20th century philosophy, then Heidegger is one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, because his work is revolutionary in many ways. He's going a new path. He has an interpretation of the history of philosophy as the history of metaphysics. And since this is grounded in fundamental metaphysical positions, it means that the great thinkers are the ones who develop the fundamental metaphysical positions. So you have some kind of guideline to choose also the philosophers you want to get in discussion with at the same time. I think there are in philosophy, we have to deal with several different things. On the one hand, you need philosophical text, whether it's Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas or Descartes or Heidegger. It's the foundation of being able to study a philosopher. And that means, as we know from the last 100 years, that you have to redo the editing of philosophical text every 50 to 100 years. An example is the Academy edition of Kant's works, which is about finished after 100 years, but they already decided they have to do a new one because the first volumes are outdated, and I think it's a sign of time moving on and people living in a different age with different understandings of philosophy, with different needs for clarification. So I think it's important that you try to open up or keep alive this tradition through editing of text, through editing manuscripts and make them publishable. You can also think of translation as something I did as well. I've translated some Heidegger. That's where this, well, I'll tell more about it a little bit later, but that's where this whole, let's say, the scholarly part of Heidegger studies. I think as a philosopher, you need to be a scholar, be aware of the text and the quality of the text. If you're able to edit text and make them available, and you can think about ways of making things available and also accessible. I think there's a big difference between people who grew up in 1950 or even earlier and studied Heidegger, and then when you're 18, 19 years old today with the totally different cultural background, and you need another kind of help to get into these texts. For a lot of people, it's already complicated to read a book that has more than 100 pages. So if you want to read a book that has 500-600 pages of dense philosophical thought, it's very hard to get into, and you need to learn. Or you need somebody who opens up a pathway for you through the book and helps you hermeneutically in the way you can read it and understand it. So that's one part of the things I try to do. Yeah, this flows into teaching as well, or in doing seminars. And I've been doing seminars for a start for 40 years or something. I started doing it in Meßkirch in 2001. We did the first seminar. It was together with Holger Saborowski. And it was in honor of Heidegger's. The one is 20. The anniversary of his death, 25 years. So we did the seminar on Gelassenheit, on releasement, or the memorial addresses, that is called in English. And the fun part was, Hoger was at that time a simple assistant of a professor at the University of Freiburg. I was this rather strange guy from Amsterdam who was walking about in the world of things Heidegger. And the fun part was that in the seminar we had Hermann Heidegger and Jörg Heidegger, the two sons of Heidegger. We had some of his grandchildren. We had the wives. And it's something you can never imagine if you're doing your dissertation on Heidegger, that one day you will be teaching his sons the thinking of their father. And Jörg Heidegger came to us afterwards and said, well, this was really nice, and I learned a lot. It's the first time I understood something of the thinking of my father. So then you think, well, he had as babysitters at people like Carl Leuwit and Hans-Georg Gadamer. He needs these two idiots to help you understand the thinking of your father. That's one of the fun parts of this kind of thing. You run into all kinds of strange meetings and wonderful meetings. And so that's one part of the stuff I'm doing. Well, from there also comes the idea of doing a Heidegger Jahrbuch, a yearbook. It's also an idea we came up with. And at first, Hermann Heidegger was in charge of the estate of Heidegger at that time. Was against it. Said, well, we have the Heidegger studies. We don't need something else. And most people then either give up or do it anyway and get into a fight with him. But I learned that you can talk to him, and if you keep at it, then at some point he might say, well, let's do it. I think it's a good idea after all. And that happened, fortunately, after 6 months or something. And then, of course, at that point, Hoger and I were pretty unknown. Still young guys. So we knew we needed a strong editorial board with people who are well known within the field of Heidegger studies. So we asked a bunch of people, and we got a really good list. But even there, we also included some of the younger generation. It's something I find important as well. It plays a big role in these Heidegger conferences we do in Meßkirch. We try to bring together the old guard and people who are working on the dissertation. We have quite a few people who did their first presentation in Meßkirch and said, well, it was the first time I did a lecture, and it was a good experience. And it's of course fun if you have people like Richardson or Kizil sitting in on your paper when you do it for the first time, and afterwards they will talk to you and say, well, it was nice, or I think this or that, or you can ask questions and talk to them. And that's one of the nice things about Meßkirch, because it's a small town. If you have a conference with 150 people, everybody will be meeting all the time anyway, because you're all going to end up in either the pizzeria or the Chinese restaurant or in the traditional German restaurant. And you will meet people all the time. So, and there's no use for professors to play being a professor and trying to impress everybody. It kind of doesn't work that way in a natural sense. And then, of course, you have the part of trying to think Heidegger further. And that's, of course, the most difficult part. It's easier to try to explain what Heidegger is saying, being in time, than to say, well, maybe you need a certain age to begin doing that. And also having the courage maybe to do it and say, well, an example is this whole Daseins analysis that was developed partly, I think, by Heidegger and Medet Bos, the Swiss psychiatrist who invited Heidegger to do seminars in his home in Solothurn. It's a suburb of Zurich. And if you look at it, then these seminars took place started in the 50s and ran into the 60s. But since then, there's hardly been any real new work been done on the whole Daseins analysis. And for me, it became pretty clear that if you become aware of the difference between the existential, ontological, and the existential, ontic, that you can see how this fundamental structure of Dasein, of existentials, is only actual in the enactment on the ontic existential level. It's only from there that you can disclose it. And that's one of the reasons that Heidegger uses this formal indication. It's like a pointing towards a structure within your own Dasein, so that you can act it yourself and make the experience what it means to be in anxiety for death, or to be in love, or all these deep human things. And this fundamental structure is probably valid, I would say, for all human beings. And that means that you have a kind of continuity and identity, not only in the present day between different cultures, or as Heidegger sometimes calls it, different houses of being because of the language, but also through the ages. We can still read Plato or Sophocles, and they still speak to us, and they tell us what it means to be human. So there must be something fundamentally connected to being human, which in itself is an empty formal structure of enactment, but which we fill in. It's like a bit like a drawing where children can color it. It's similar to that, and I think there's one of the main strong points of Heidegger. But I think also in Being in Time, which in itself is a complicated book with a complicated history, and was written incredibly fast, based on material that Heidegger gathered over the 10 years before. And that also means that there's room for improvement. Or if I were a Daseins analyst, I would be asking myself the question, are all the existentials in Being in Time, or can we develop other ones and different ones that may also help us in our attempt to help human beings to come to a better self-understanding, or to make their understanding of their own possibilities and freedom greater. I think you should look in that direction. You find some other existentials in Heidegger's writings after Being in Time. You could also say that in a sense he's rethinking Being in Time in his later philosophy, starting around 1944-45, when he starts, first of all, doing these conversations on a country path, 3 different conversations, and in his development also of the notion of Gelassenheit, of the fourfold. For me, the fourfold is a retrieval of the Greek understanding of physis. I think it's a mistake a lot of philosophers make, or Heidegger scholars make, that they think that Heidegger wants to go back to the Greek understanding of physis. They will use the same words. Well, logos is one of the names. Of course, it is a name for the Greeks, but it's not a name that we can use today anymore. So I think there we need to develop Heidegger thinking further as well. An important topic is Heidegger's relation to National Socialism, which I don't want to run away from. I want to look it right in the eye and try to understand it and present it as objectively as I can. I think a lot of people run into extremes where either there's no problem at all or everything is problematic, but in the end it boils down to the same thing, that if all of Heidegger is Nazism, then you will have a difficult time of clarifying what Nazism is within itself. There's a big difference between Heidegger and Himmler, and if you reduce everything to the same, then you can't make distinctions anymore. And if you can't make distinctions, it's very hard to come to an understanding of something. And if you say everything's all right, there's no problem, you're making it too easy for yourself, because there are reasons why Heidegger was attracted to National Socialism, and I will not go into the details here now, but I've been writing about it and doing seminars on it. And I've always had a double relationship with the university. On the one hand, I think it's a great institution, and it makes things possible. It's one of the problems if you don't have such a structure. Anything you do will be very much relying on you as a person, and as soon as you're no longer there, it will be gone. So that's a reason to try to find structures as well that can exist longer than you as a person can. If you look at the philosophy departments or philosophers in general, I think there aren't that many philosophers. There are a lot of professors of philosophy. I think you have a hard time finding a philosopher among them. For me, it has to do also with living what you think and think what you live. It's kind of double play. It's something Heidegger did. I'm convinced of that. He was struggling with the complexity of his own life, complexity of the time he lived in, and at the same time trying to find solutions and contributions to finding new ways and new understandings. And that's something I'm trying to do on my own limited level. I'm aware very well of the fact that I'm not Heidegger. That's also a reason to say, instead of only writing books, maybe also important to keep Heidegger thinking alive and accessible for everybody who wants to read it, and especially young people. There is an academic Heidegger, as is taught in academia, and there's another way of doing Heidegger, or several other ways, basically, that you would never be able to do at the university, but which you can do in something like another place, or a place for another kind of thinking. And that's what I'm trying to do, to develop that further. And it will be difficult, but I'll hope that I can get enough people interested, either in participating in some of the things I will be organizing, or by staying here for some time, or through my Patreon support group, which I should try to get more people. For me, it's I think doing philosophy because it's a way of living. It's this idea of having maybe 4 to 8 people here, and then just sit outside, which you can do most of the time. You can talk, you can discuss, and you can. It's a bit like we did with this seminar on the conversation on the country path. I don't think you can do that kind of discussion in a university setting. So that's one way of opening up different approaches to Heidegger, making Heidegger accessible in different ways, and thinking Heidegger further. And of course, in an academic setting, they'll immediately shoot you down. It should be interpretation of the text. You have to read all these, quote all the literature. Well, I think do your own thinking is more important than quoting all the literature. So I want to. This is a first attempt. If I could do it on the scale I would like to do it at some point, but this is a kind of a tryout, you could say. And then it would really be a big place where you can have a lot of people, where people can stay and work, and a bit more like a kind of communal living at the same time. If somebody says, well, I'm an artist, I like to make... you could contribute in different ways. If you have little money, well, you can help with redoing a shed, or create something and give that away, or do some cooking, and contribute in a non-financial way. And if you have some money and you say, well, I think this is important or it's interesting, I want to support it, even if it's not for me. But I think, for me, I'm convinced that it's important that there are some places left, free spaces of thinking. And that's what I try to create through different possibilities. One way of doing it is in Meßkirch, another way of doing it is this project I'm working on now. And it's universities are no longer the free spaces of thinking. I think that's gone. It's been destroyed. It's too tied up in the external funding and basically in... The philosophy departments are run now by managers and no longer by the philosophers. So I think there's a problem there. And it's this distrust that is, if you give somebody money, you have to be sure that every penny is spent in the right way and where it goes. And I think you can trust people, give them a little trust. And, so that's what these things are for. So I'm trying to develop my Solicon stuff and combine it at the same time. I think it's something I will be doing. I like the idea of doing something that happens here and now. And if you're there, you're part of it. And if you're not there, you miss it. If you can mix it with Zoom, as we tried at the weekend, so that may be a way of doing it. But I would like to have just 4 people here or 6 people here and say, well, we're living together for a week, and it's a different way. I think this moment of philosophy being a way of living is central to everything I do. And it's funny that even with the Philosophisch Café in Meßkirch, people said, well, there's nobody going to come because everybody's afraid to say something in front of somebody else from Meßkirch. But people come, but you have a meaningful discussion. And you talk about friendship, or you talk about death, or you talk about illness, and everybody can relate to it because we're talking about human beings. And I think that's what Heidegger is great at, talking about human beings. And if you translate it, in a sense, into a more contemporary kind of language, then it can be meaningful to a lot of people. And Heidegger is still inspiring artists, using his ideas on art to create. I think you can use Heidegger, use is a bad word, but you can make Heidegger, it should be the word be, relevant maybe. In psychiatry, in psychotherapy, I think there's notions of overcoming this division between the cogito and the extended substance is still very important, and it's more important now than it ever was, in my opinion. Because this whole calculative thinking is slowly taking over the world. It's not the only thing there, fortunately, so we can still try and mend it a little bit, which is also something I want to do with this place. When I did my dissertation, the funny part is I first wrote a dissertation that my thesis advisor, I think it's called in English, accepted. He said, well, I find it interesting. It was a 2-part project. I wanted to develop my own ideas on life and philosophy. And at the University of Amsterdam, where the philosophy department is right in the city center. And if you walk from there to the central station of Amsterdam, there are different ways of walking there. There's one way is going through the red light district, and you come to these bridges where they would sell either pills or heroin and cocaine. You could buy anything you want in that respect. And I had read this book on Die Kinder von Bahnhof Zoo, which is the memoir of Christiane F., which was a young girl who got into drugs when she was 13, 14. And I thought it's hardly possible that these things still happen today. We live in a civilized country. But so for me, it was a reason to get to know some of these girls in Amsterdam. I would spend time with them, and they would talk with me. And it gave me an insight into a world that normally you avoid. It's the same with homeless people. I met a woman who was standing in the street in the rain. At first I gave her some money, like everybody does. And then when I walked on, I said, well, that's not the right way to do it. So I went back and said, well, would you like to have a coffee or something? She said, well, it would be nice. So we went into a bar, restaurant. And it's already funny if you see the look of the people. If you come in with an obvious homeless person, it looks scared. And we started talking, and she started telling me about her life and how she ended up on the streets, and she had no contact with her children anymore. And she had a bag, and from this bag she pulled these little books, kind of wisdom books, Chinese wisdom, Indian wisdom, Western wisdom, and started reading a bit from it. So, well, this is very important. This is this is what life is about. So I spent maybe 2 hours with her. And all these experiences I had, and I talked to a girl who was raped by her stepbrothers when she was 11, who ran away from home, had went to the toilet when she was 12, and then she had immediate abortion, so she was looking at something in the toilet. And then, of course, it's not so difficult to understand that people want to stop the hurt. That's a reason to take drugs or to take alcohol or having an eating disorder. And it's very difficult to get away from it, because as soon as you stop suppressing the experience and the pain, it comes back. And that's why most of them are stuck. I tried to help one girl in particular. In the end, she had AIDS. She wanted to go home to Germany to see her mother and die there. So I put her on the train with a ticket to Germany. Never seen her or heard from her since, but for me that's also a way of doing philosophy, but I'm a bit strange in that respect. And I wrote a two-piece dissertation. The first one was more the philosophical side, and the second part was the story I could tell about these girls and the things I learned from them and experience with them. I wanted to do it as a movie, but that was a bit too ambitious. So when I finished my dissertation, my thesis advice said, well, this is great, I like this. This is something different. It's not the usual Fichte said this or Plato said that. But the committee killed it within 5 minutes. So that's when I decided, well, okay, if you don't want to do this, which is a bit different, then I'll write a book on Heidegger. So I wrote my thesis on Heidegger in 3 months or something, 400 pages. And that was no problem, that was accepted. And of course you make the experience that you think, well, I didn't think that, but most people who write a dissertation think that they're really contributing to humanity. Or it's so important to yourself that you assume that everybody thinks this is really great and important. But when you have your defense of your thesis, then you come to the realization that most of the members of the committee only read the first 10 pages or something, or until they could find a question. And of course, you have always one who will start talking, and after 15 minutes will say, what was my question again? Of the 45 or the minutes or the hour that you have to defend your thesis, it's always good to have someone like that who fills in 25 minutes. And then he asked his question, which was the last one, and I just replied with the answer, yes. That's the only thing I remember about the question. My father always was in cinema and movies. It's not the time and the place to get into all that, but he decided when he was around 60, 65 that he would retire and start something else in his life. And that's what he did, and he always loved France. Did a lot of work with French filmmakers and was a lot in Paris. And so we bought a house in the south of France, not too far from Toulouse. And I moved there first. I was going to write my dissertation, and said, well, I can do that in France as well. Why not have the experience of living in a different country? And I thought I would be back in Holland in 3 or 4 years or something. But we stayed there for almost 20 years. And at some point, after I finished my dissertation, I said, well, it's nice to be here out by myself, but I want to get in touch with people again and grow as a person, probably. So on the one hand, I created my Center for Philosophy, Centre Philosophique La Jaurbuch, in France. And the idea I had was to offer weeks of philosophy to people who are interested in philosophy but are neither students nor professionals, but just have an interest in philosophical questions. So. And the other thing was to do weeks with younger people from university. So we would read text by Heidegger or by Hegel or by Schelling, and everybody would do a presentation as well, so you could talk about what you were working on. And the third thing I did was some philosophical conferences, and because this little village, Pondersroe, which is on the river, and the Vior, which has a very old medieval bridge, and a small hotel on the other side, we could lodge people, and that's... I also started going to these international conferences, and I became a member of the Fichte Society and the Schelling Society and the Heidegger Society, of course. But there was this huge Fichte conference in 1994. It was 200 years of the doctrine of science. And in Jena, they had a conference with maybe 200 papers, something like that. It started in the morning at 9 and it lasted until 9 in the evening. And if you only have Fichte's doctrine of science being thrown at you the whole day, it's not easy. So at one point I ended up in a restaurant and I was sitting at a table, and opposite of me there was an American professor. And all the other people at the table were taking out their pocket Fichte and started discussing again. But Fichte said in 1794 he said this, but in 1795 he was already changing his position a little bit. And we just said, well, we have had enough Fichte for one day. So we just started talking. He asked me, who are you, what are you doing? And I told him I had this private institute. And of course, that's the good thing about Americans, is that they always like that. For Germans, it's the end of the conversation. The German professor immediately thinks, well, you will not invite me to something interesting, and excuse me, I will be gone. So the guy was Tom Rockmore, and he said, well, I would be happy to do one conference with you in France, and you can invite some people, send you a list, and you can tell them that I'm in it as well. So that's what I did. And the first one was on Heidegger and Neo-Kantianism. And I invited people. Some people I had met, some people he suggested. So that's how I got to know Ted Kizil. He came to Pondersroe. At that time he was around 70 years old. And he would go out every morning for his run along the river in his jogging suit, hairband. And he's a big guy, a grey beard. And it was really nice. But it was the same thing. They would all live within 20 meters of each other. We'd have all the meals together. We'd have a breakfast and lunch, and in the evening, it's easy if you bring some salad and cheese and enough red wine, then everybody's happy, and the conversations will go on for a long time. So I did about 3 or 4 of them, and we financed it ourselves. I started going to Meßkirch in the late 1990s, and I had this idea because it was in the late 80s the stuff came out about Heidegger and National Socialism, the book by Farias, etc. And Hugo Ott did some of it. And when you start reading all this stuff, and it's even worse today, you realize that a lot of people are just copying what other people have said. So I thought, well, I need to study it myself to see where the truth is, or where I would see the way I would see it and judge it. But then I said to myself, well, if you want to focus on Heidegger and National Socialism, you basically have to do it in the context of his life. So that's where the idea of a biography came from. And when I had that idea, I thought, well, maybe that's an interesting thing to start working on. And so it was about more than 20 years ago. It's strange how fast time flies, but there was a reason for me. Since I knew Ted Kizil, he said, well, this Hermann Heidegger, that's impossible. He's a German colonel and basically a Nazi, so you can't talk to him. I said, well, I'm going to try anyway. So I wrote Hermann Heidegger a letter, and I said, well, dear Mr. Heidegger, I'm Alfred Denker. I come from Amsterdam. I've done my dissertation on Heidegger, and I've written this historical dictionary of Heidegger at that point, and I have the intention of writing a biography your father. And I think it's normal that I introduce myself shortly to you. So if you ever hear about some strange Dutch guy walking about, asking about your father, then you know it's me. So then he wrote back to me and said, well, thank you for your letter and your interest in the work and life of my father. But in my opinion, it will take at least 20 years to write a biography, because you also need to have the access to the whole of the Gesamtausgabe. Well, that was the open door I could get in through. I said, well, that's exactly my opinion. I expect to be on it for 20 years. It will be 30 by now. But at least I've read what has been published in the Gesamtausgabe. At that time, it was more than a little over 60 volumes. And I can read the rest as it is published. But once it is all published, you're never going to find an idiot who's going to read this 100 volumes. And that somehow struck a bell with him. And then he invited me. Next time I was in Freiburg, I could come and visit him. So I was in Freiburg, and I thought, he's a military guy, he's German, so one thing is important, punctuality. So the day before our meeting, I drove from my hotel to his house to see how long it would take me. And know the way, so I wouldn't get lost. And the next day, I didn't realize, because on the road to his house, there's the football stadium of Freiburg, the sport club. And there was a match on that Saturday. So there was a lot of traffic, and you had to drive around, but I was still early enough to arrive before 2 o'clock. So I waited in my car for 10 minutes and then walked to his house and waited and looked at my watch for 14:00, and precisely at 14:00 I pushed the bell, and Hermann Heidegger opened the door, and the first thing he said to me, Herr Denker, Sie sind auch pünktlich. And we talked for 4 hours or something, to 6, 6:30. And when I left, he said to me, well, of course, next time when you come, you can be our house guest. And you understand, we never met, so I couldn't invite you straight away. So from then on, I would spend days at his house. And he had this little office with a sofa, and the sofa was covered with piles of ordners and manuscripts, and there were 2 or 3 occasions where, when he was sleeping, the pile fell over him and he almost got killed in all the stuff he had collected. But we got along very well, and the interesting part was also that you have 2 Hermann Heideggers. You had the Hermann Heidegger that you would meet, who was the colonel, with a kind of mask, basically. And if he would be sitting in the evening after his wife had gone to bed, he would go to a cellar and bring a bottle of wine. He would find these 30-year-old Riesling wines he had gotten for his departure from the army or something. But he was always saying, well, it's drinkable. Sometimes I thought it might not be as drinkable as you think, but who am I? And when we had a glass of wine, then you could see his face change. He would become like a grandfather. That was the time to ask him something. If you wanted to get something done, you had to wait for that moment. There was a small archive in Meßkirch. It was started by a guy called Hermann, who was working at the town hall, was the Hauptamt. And he liked Heidegger's work. He obviously knew him personally as well. And in the 50s, he started collecting newspaper clippings, and he started asking passing philosophers if they could send books for his archive. And in the town hall, there was a small room where this stuff was kept. So that was for me a reason to ask. And there I found some trace or something of these very early newspaper clippings. Because there were 2 newspapers when Heidegger was a student. There was the Heuberger Volksblad, which is Catholic, and there was the Oberbadische Grenzbote, which was a liberal newspaper. And there were always fights between them. And there I found these very early writings of Heidegger, and also reports on the first lectures that he gave in Meßkirch for the Junggesellenverein, where he would talk about Nietzsche and The counting horses. It took me a long while to figure out what that was. I'll get back to it in a bit. But there's all stuff that nobody had looked at for ages. And I met this woman who was a distant cousin of Heidegger, and she had been doing a lot of this family tree research and saved clippings and photos, and had a guest book when Heidegger had visitors. He would write something in it. So together with her, I did this book, Heidegger und seine Heimat, where we collected all that stuff, and it was a nice way of doing it. And the other thing I discovered was one of the first people I went to visit was Gadamer, obviously, because he was already in his 90s. I thought, well, if I want to meet Gadamer, I better hurry. He lived to be 102, I think. So, and I could use Hermann Heidegger's name. As I wrote to him and said, well, of course, you can come by and come to Heidelberg and you can meet me. And in Heidelberg, there was also I knew that the literary estate of Emil Lask, a Neo-Kantian pupil of Heinrich Rickert, who was for Heidegger an important influence when he was still studying philosophy, was there. So I also went to the university archive, but there was nothing interesting in that in these papers. But I remembered that Rickert was also a professor at Heidelberg, and then I asked the archivist if he had something on Rickert, and then he showed me the list of everything they had, lecture courses and also correspondence, and there I found the letters from Heidegger to Rickert. And I got copies, and I spent an afternoon sitting there. And by the end, after 4 hours, I discovered that Heidegger finished by saying "hoogachtungsvoll," and started with "sehr verehrte Herr Geheimrat," but for everything in between I couldn't read. Didn't know how to read Heidegger's handwriting, so that when I showed Hermann Heidegger, he told me, well, it's amazing that nobody ever thought of looking there. Kahneman was the professor there for 40 years, I think. Leut was there. And then he looked on his own list of all the materials in Marbach. And there are 13 letters from Rickert to Heidegger. And if Heidegger kept that many letters, it means it's an important relationship, because he burned an incredible amount of letters. So then he told me, well, since you discovered them, you should be editing them. And then, of course, you have always two possibilities. You can say yes, and you can say no. Well, if I say no, well, it's probably the end of the story. So I better say yes, and then see how I can find a way of working around it and come to a printable something. So that's what I did. And but that was the first Heidegger edition I did. And then later he told me, Hermann Heidegger, well, you should also do a volume of the Gesamtausgabe. So I have one volume in the Gesamtausgabe, which is on the fundamental metaphysical positions of Western metaphysics. And, well, I'm the only non-German who's editor of the Gesamtausgabe. And these are things, if you think back, when I was reading Heidegger when I was 17, 18 years old, you could never imagine that you would end up there. You would be staying at the son's house, the house where also with his granddaughter, Gertrude, lived now in the house in Zering, but I spent days there as well. And it's kind of fun to be in the same house. It's both a bit of nonsense, and at the same time it has something. It's the same as the cabin. If you go inside the cabin, it gives you a better understanding, I think, of Heidegger and his personality, and maybe even his work. But it's not because you've been at the cabin that you will immediately understand everything that Heidegger has written. And it's the same as Meßkirch. If you are there and you see where you grew up and lived, and it's still very similar. It's of course changed, but the main things are still there. And the Veldweg is no longer really a Veldweg. It's part of it's now a street. But you can still, if you go further, it's with tarmac, so it's the country paths in that sense is no longer there, but you have similar country passes around Meßkirch everywhere, so you can get the feeling. And if you look back to the town, you can see the church tower just the way Heidegger could see it. So It was a nice thing to do. With these summer schools, which we do in Meßkirch, we also go on the Veldweg with the students, and then we read the Veldweg on the Veldweg. And we read Aus der Wagen des Denkens in Toutnerberg at the cabin in 3 languages. It was kind of nice things, and people like it. And of course, when we go back with the coach, and it takes about an hour and a half, 2 hours by coach. We get our own special Heidegger Express coach. On the way back, we stop at the Schnapps Museum. And people can buy some schnapps, and it's really nice. It's a different way of doing things, but it makes people connect. And maybe that's the thing I learned first, and it's the thing I stayed with all my life, is to try and create an open space, an openness. But it's a safe space. You can say what you want. Nobody's going to laugh. Nobody's just open up, and that's one of the things. Maybe about a seminar. If you do it with 10, 15 people, or even more, it's having a kind of, it should be kind of release, literally, in Gelassenheit, where you let each other be, and you listen to each other, and you're interested in what everybody has to contribute, and that's a way of doing it, I think. And that's the main thing, and it's kind of interesting to see that it seems to work the same way with Zoom. If I see when we started about a year ago, and how it developed over that 1 year, and of course there are people who did one course, and sometimes I still hear from them, or there are people who just disappear. But there's a group of people who come to most of the things I do, and between these people, you can see something like friendship starting, although they've never seen each other in real life. And in a sense, I learned it from Heidegger. This way of trying to... I think that's the trick with Heidegger. He had this capability of making people feel at ease or welcome or taken seriously. He never was the professor. Günter Fiegel is a professor. I'm the professor. Here's my assistant, here's my other assistant, here are my 3 habilitation students, and I have 15, 20 doctoral students, and I'm very important because I know Sellers, who is a very important American scholar. I know Volpi, who's very important Italian professor, and if they introduce each other, they will say, well, this is this world-renowned Heidegger interpreter from Germany, Professor Fiegel. So everybody knows something important is going to happen. It disgusts me, but it's how it works. And, well, I'll stay away from the topic of Fiegel. But anyway, I think this openness is... And it's interesting if you do a seminar, sometimes you have some students from China, sometimes. You have old people who've been reading Heidegger for 30, 40 years in the spare time. And some of them are more versed in Heidegger than most of the scholars I know. And then you find a way of mixing it. And I think that it's always this element of living. I think that to philosophize is to live. And to live is basically to philosophize. It's the same thing Heidegger says, that everybody, or Aristotle, every human being has this kind of wonder and this kind of questioning going on. What is there? What is the world? Who am I? Where did I come from? Where am I going to? Why am I in this place? And what should I do now that I'm here? So you have all these notions in Heidegger with thrownness and resoluteness, etc., that I think are important to come to an understanding of yourself. And I think modesty is important. Don't take yourself too seriously. I'm just making it up as I go along, and you learn and you take your experiences you had. So with the Heidegger Jahrbuch, it was the same thing. The first volume came out in, I think, 2004. So that's already more than 15 years. And Basically, you can't do it because there's no money. Everything I do is without money, basically. The things, so also this Heidegger Jahrbuch. But the good thing was that you have this publisher in Freiburg, Verlag called Alber, which was one of the main philosophy publishers in Germany. But it went through a really bad period, and the mother concern, Herder, which is a big publishing house, especially in Latin America, they have a lot of newspapers, and they publish everything by the Vatican and everything the Pope does. So they have this small Karl Alber Verlag as something interesting. So they wanted to restart the publishing house. And for that reason, the Heidegger Jahrbuch was an important thing, because they could reconnect with authors that they had formerly but gone away. And that's how we managed to set it up. There's a Heidegger Foundation in Meßkirch that they buy 100 copies of each yearbook, and they make it available for universities and Goethe institutes all over the world, so that in countries where people cannot afford to buy the Heidegger Jahrbuch, they can still have access to it through either a university library or a Goethe institute. So they're going to South America, they're going to Romania and countries like that in Europe. And that's also a way of financing it. It's something I always have been aware of, that at some point there has to be some money that can keep it going. If there's no money, at some point you're just gonna close the shop. So anyway, the Heidegger Jahrbuch has been running now. We're going to publish volume 14 this year. In total it must be 5,000 pages or something. And we hope to continue in the next few years. So, when I was doing this first Heidegger conference in France, I got a letter from what's his name, Douglas Hadley, who was studying and writing his dissertation at the University of Munich, but he came from England, of course, and later he became a professor at Cambridge University. And he wrote me a letter to say that he had seen that I was organizing this conference and he would very much like to present the paper. And he sent me a CV and some articles so that the committee could judge if he would be an appropriate candidate to present something. So I sat down with myself and I discussed it with myself for 50 seconds. And I said, well, you can come. Later he asked me if he could bring his wife, who was pregnant at the time. I said, well, no problem, the more the merrier. And when he was there, it turned out that his wife was the granddaughter of Gräfin Sophie Podewiels. And Podewiels, her husband, was the secretary of the Bavarian Academy of the Fine Arts, who invited Heidegger to give these talks like Das Ding and Die Frage nach der Technik. And there was an intense relationship also between the Gräfin Sophie and Heidegger. And when I was talking with Sophie, she told me that her mother, the daughter of the Podewiels, still had a lot of letters from Heidegger to her mother. And so I got in touch with her mother and she invited me to come over to Munich, where she was living. And she told me I have about 150 letters. And Hermann Heidegger told me that all the letters that Heidegger wrote to Sophie Podewiels were destroyed by her in accordance with Heidegger's wishes. So he was very surprised when he found out that there were still 150 left. And she said, well, I have this has been hanging around my neck like a stone because I don't want to settle my kids with this stuff. She had 4 children, I think. But I can't read Heidegger's handwriting. And then I said, well, I can read it, so maybe it's an idea that we read them together. That I will read them, and she would be sitting there and typing it on her laptop. That's what we did for maybe 2 weeks in total over a couple of years. It's of course interesting if you're reading these letters basically as the second person, because the first one was Sophie. And the longest letter is more than 50 pages. And there are also some small texts that Heidegger wrote, especially for her. One on Sophia, for her birthday, because her name is Sophie. So it's and the interesting thing with these letters that Heidegger writes to these women is that he's more open than he is in letters to other philosophers. And he has to explain it, thinking, in a bit different way than when he's talking to Gadamer or Lewitt. So I think they show sides of Heidegger that are pretty unknown until now. But that's... so Douglas spent this seminar or this conference with us, and then when I was doing one on Schelling with the young academics, he wrote to me again from Cambridge and asked if he could come again and if it would be all right if he brought a student with him. Okay, as you know, the more the merrier. So the student he brought with him was Holger. And that's how we got to know each other in Pont de Seroux. And my father picked him up from the airport, and he thought my father was me. Because I was a philosopher, and my father, like I have now, this grey hair. And he was a kind of an actor. So he would be impersonating a philosopher. So a lot of people were fooled by this. And then they met me, this young guy, and they said, oh. But it was... the beginning of a long friendship. We've been friends for 25 years or something. And it goes by so quickly. The Heidegger Gesellschaft, it was grounded because Hartmut Buchner, and then we can go to the Heidegger Archive, who was a student of Heidegger's, and he also was a member, he edited some of the Academy edition of Schelling. And he was very well connected in Japan. He spoke Japanese. And he set up an annual meeting between translators of Heidegger's Gesamtausgabe into Japanese. And they will meet 1 year in Japan and 1 year in Meßkirch. He married a very rich woman, which allowed him to assemble a library of some 40,000 volumes. And he had the idea, because he liked Meßkirch, just a bit of the background. In Meßkirch, you have this huge castle, or schloss, and it was in a really bad state. So at some point, they decided they would need to renovate it. And Meßkirch, the city, paid money, and the Landkreis, and especially the Bundesland, and even from the European community that got funding. It was a multi-million mark project, and they decided also at that time that they wanted to do a Heidegger museum within this renovated schloss. And Buchner said, well, if you do also an archive there, I will donate my library. But there's one condition, that you hire a librarian. And there you can see where the problems start. So in the Schloss in Meßkirch, there's one central wing where you have, on the one side, you have the Heidegger Museum and the Heidegger Archive. And on the other side, you have the seminary rooms. And on the first floor, there's this big festive hall where you can have up to 1,000 people, I think. There's a huge kitchen behind it. They use it a lot for weddings, where people rent the facility. And they can have a caterer cook there. And at the top, there's a small apartment in the tower with 3 bedrooms and a kitchen and a bathroom. And a table where you can sit and eat. And I have one room for myself, and the other 2 we can make available for researchers. So we introduced the idea of fellowships, where somebody can say, well, I want to spend 2 weeks in Meßkirch to work in the archive and to write. Or a student can apply, I'm working on my dissertation, would like to stay a month. And you can stay there for free. That's basically what the fellowship is. So you have to pay your travel expenses and you have to buy your own food, but you can do your own cooking. So it's a really cheap way of spending a longer time there. And the problem with the idea of Buchner was that it's nice to have 40,000 volumes, build a library so they could put them in there. But if you pay a librarian, let's say about 100,000 euros a year, with all the costed amount to the salary, then the first question you could ask yourself is what he's going to do. Because Meßkirch is in between Freiburg and Munich, and in Munich you have huge libraries, far bigger. You have even in Bordeaux a library that's 10 times bigger. And in Freiburg you have the same as the university library, so who's going to come to Meßkirch to use the library? And Buchner passed away and passed on to his children, and his children then put an ultimatum to the city: if you don't decide by then that you're going to hire a librarian, we'll take the books. And what they did is sell them to make money, which is a pity in itself. And then, of course, there was a need to have some ideas on what to do with the facilities. And then I drafted a program or an idea of how to do it, together with Holger. And our idea was to say, well, you have to organize things. So first of all, you put together a program of seminars and conferences and lectures. And second thing you can do is to build it not as basically as an archive, but do it as an archive of recordings and photos and videos and stuff like that. So that's what we did, and we started doing interviews with people who had known Heidegger still personally. So there's, if somebody would have done it 20 years ago, you could still have talked to Elfriede and to his brother. They didn't do it, so what was possible we tried to do. And we have about 20 interviews with Kiesil, with Hermann Heidegger, Jörg Heidegger, etc., etc. So if people stay there, you can see it there. It's not on the internet. You can watch the stuff, and you can use the library that we have assembled in the meantime, which is a couple of 1,000 volumes anyway. So you have the Gesamtausgabe, you have the single editions, and etc. Some secondary literature and a lot of translations. We have a copy of basically every translation of Heidegger. So if you're English or Spanish or Italian, you can work there. You don't have to bring the books. Of course, we're not trying to promote. Holger and I also started this Heidegger correspondence edition, which is also a project of the Heidegger Stiftung and the Heidegger Archive. So we're trying to build it up, and we have people staying there and doing research. There have been some publications on the materials in the archive. And so that's something it's worked well, and we'll try to start again after the COVID period and have more of real presence conferences again. That's one of the reasons we moved to Zoom, or I moved to Zoom, is that you couldn't do it in Meßkirch anymore. Against this background, we'll move to the Denkwege. The first thing you need to understand is that Heidegger basically had 3 publishing houses. The first one was Niemeyer, because Niemeyer was also publishing the Jahrbuch für Philosophie und Phänomenologische Forschung that was edited by Edmund Husserl. And Husserl himself published his writings also with Niemeyer. So it's also the publisher of Being and Time. Interesting enough, it's only after the Second World War that Heidegger started publishing with Niemeyer again. His book, second book, Kant und das Problem der Metaphysik, Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics, was published by Cohen. And Cohen was a Jewish publishing house, interesting enough. And Cohen was later, there was a guy working there who was Vittorio Klosterman. And in the early 1930s, he took over the publishing house and started his own publishing house, Klosterman. He started publishing Heidegger. First thing Heidegger published with Klosterman is probably Hölderlin und das Wesen der Dichtung. From the 1950s onward, Kloosterman published Weekmark, Holtzweek, etc. And so you have the two publishing houses, and then Heidegger met Günther Neske, who also started his own publishing house in Munich on a very early morning. It was still fog over the sea they were staying close to, and they met there. And Heidegger was impressed because Neske had been a pilot during the Second World War. Neske was an interesting guy. He was great at finding writers and attract people. There's a lot of famous people who published in his small publishing house. Ernst Jünger, Bienswanger, Gottfried Benn, Heidegger. And Heidegger published basically with him 4 books. You have the Satz vom Grund, the Principle of the Ground. You have Unterwegs zur Sprache, On the Way to Language. And you have Vorträge and Aufsätze, essays and conferences. It's never been translated completely into English. They translated different texts and put them in different volumes, so it was a bit of a mess, basically. And then he had this 2-volume Nietzsche interpretation and a lot of small texts that he published, like Aus der Erfahrung des Denkens, Hebel der Hausfreund, Die Technik und die Kehre, Identität und Differenz, und was ist das, die Philosophie? These were all published in the, let's say, around in the 1950s. The last one is 1962, and they've been reprinted and reprinted. And I noticed that, first of all, if you look at the print, it gets grey, and you can find the same in editions of the Silent Side. If you have a very bad print, basically. It's incredibly bad. And of course the typesetting and the way the volume was done, it was great in the 50s or the 60s, but nowadays you could do something a bit more modern. And so I told my lecturer, because I've been publishing with Klet Kotta, who took over Neske after Neske. Neske still sold it when he was alive, but he was not a very good businessman, so it was not a financial success. And Klet Kotta is basically Klet, who was the biggest publishing house of school books in Germany. And they bought the name Kotta. Kotta is the old publishing house that published Goethe and Schelling, and that's the prestige. So. And they have now Klet Kotta as one of the publishing houses of the 25 they have to do a bit of philosophy, history. They have, for example, also the rights of Tolkien, the German translations. That's the thing they made a lot of money with. And they inherited there, because Michael Klet, who was the son of Ernst Klet, was friends with Ernst Jünger. He did the Jünger edition of his works, and his father also knew Heidegger, and he also knew him. So they still have Heidegger also as something. And if you have as a publisher nowadays, this idea is gone, but you have a responsibility to the public and for the text and the author. You have to make these texts available in good editions. So that's when I started. Michael Klet was still the director at the time, and I said, "Well, I think we should do a new edition of these books." For Nietzsche, it was a bit different, because when the Gesamtausgabe edition of Nietzsche was published, they bought the typeset, and they're now identical, the prints. So that was modernized, and they didn't want to spend money on that one. I think you should still do it. because the way we did this is different. Well, it grew over time. It's taken a long time to get it in the form it is now. In the beginning, it's always difficult to get Hermann Heidegger on board. And to get Hermann Heidegger on board, we needed some financial concessions from his part, because Heidegger got an author fee of 20%. And the other thing is doing an e-book. So I had to convince Hermann Heidegger, basically, to say, well, if we can do this new edition that's so important, then you should take a cut to help finance it. It got too expensive, but okay, that's not my problem. But it's in the end he agreed, and they came to an agreement, Michael Klett and Hermann Heidegger. And then, of course, 3 volumes are easy because it's just 3 books, so you do those 3. And the 4th one is then the collection for the small volumes. Now, there are several things at play. One is that if you want to buy these books in the Gesamtausgabe, you can't buy them individually. Because the way the Gesamtausgabe, originally it was supposed to be a project of the 3 publishing houses, Kloosterman, Niemeyer and Neske. But it got turned around in such a way, Kloosterman is the only one publishing the Gesamtausgabe. And then Neske. And Niemeyer said, well, if you want to publish our books within this Gesamtausgabe, you cannot sell them independently of the Gesamtausgabe, which means that if you want to buy Being and Time, or you want to buy the Nietzsche volumes, you have to buy the complete first Abteilung of the Gesamtausgabe, which is 16 volumes. And of course, in the Gesamtausgabe, they put in the marginalia that Heidegger had in his copy of these books. So if you want to have that text available, well, either you have to buy the whole set or you can't get it. So that was a reason to say, well, if we're going to do it, and we add this, and when I start first looking at the volumes, Heidegger's own copies, I could see that there were Friedrich von Hermann, Friedrich Wilhelm von Hermann, who edited the Gesamtausgabe volumes, basically didn't include everything you can find. He decided not to include internal references to pages, which in itself is interesting because it shows you a bit of how Heidegger works, and he didn't include all the marginalia. So we edited all the marginalia, and we also put in the pagination numbers of the first edition, because if you have books that were written, if you read Puckler's The Denkwerk Martin Heidegger, he's referring to the first edition. And in the Gesamtausgabe, sometimes they have that, sometimes they don't. If you read Gelassenheit in volume 16, there's no pagination. So it makes it very difficult simply to work with. So basically the idea we had is to say, well, what's the best way of presenting this text in a new, more accessible way, and give you as much material as there is. So we included also some of the letters that were kept in the volumes by Heidegger. There are additional notes. There are these Stichwortverzeichnisse that Heidegger made himself, and we included them as well. So you get basically as complete as possible the materials and the text. And in the footnotes, we are very much limiting ourselves and try to stay away from interpretation. But for example, if he quotes a poem from Hölderlin, we include the poem in the footnotes. So you don't have to look in somewhere to find the text, because we have the same edition that Heidegger used at that time. And it will be available as e-book as well, so that's one of the big steps. I think this is one of the most modern editions of philosophical text at the moment. So instead of being boring old Heidegger, always the same, reprint, you have now something that puts it on a different level. That's the idea, basically. So it should be interesting enough also for countries like the US and the UK to do new translations. That's one of the things I told Hermann Heidegger that would happen. And you can now, you have all the stuff that you have in the Gesamtausgabe and more, in these 4 volumes. It was supposed to be a cassette in a carton, but because it got pretty expensive, the publishing house didn't want to pay the money for the carton. So, and the 2 ribbons within the books we wanted to have. The name Denkweger for the 4 volumes is of course our invention. But I think they give a great overview of Heidegger's thinking, let's say from 1950 onwards. In that sense, I think the title Denkweger is a good one. The change from Vorträge und Aufsätze to Bouwen ohne Denken, Vorträge und Aufsätze, is mainly to show that this is something new. It's Vorträge und Aufsätze, but it's done in a new way with a lot of material that you won't find. So that's also making clear to people why you should probably get the volume, even if you already have one. And of course, I think the layout and the photos and everything and the typeset is very agreeable, and it's nice to read and nice to work with. So the cover photos are all by Melo Markovic. And Melo Markovic was a photographer who was hired by Spiegel. She had been working with the Spiegel before to do the photos when they were doing the interview with Heidegger. But she made a bunch of photos. She stayed longer, and she also took these photos in Totenauberg. So there are, I think there must be 300-400 photos by her. And some of them are still unpublished, so that's also an expensive element. You pay the rights to use the photos. For the Kera, there's a download you can do of the facsimile of the Heidegger's manuscript and the transcription of the manuscript. Where you can see he crossed out several sentences. We managed to figure out what he crossed out, so that's something you get with it. It was too expensive to include it in the book. It's a big, but it's available. So if you buy the book, the kleine Schriften, then you can get the code for the download. You can download it on the page of the publishing house. So I think that's not a bad solution. That was one of the things that got me going. The editor in the Gesamtausgabe writes that Peter Jäger, that the text of the 2 texts, you have the Keras Heidegger published it with Neske, and that's typical also of the problems with the Gesamtausgabe. So that's, if you talk about an edition in the last hand, that's the last hand of Heidegger, that text is the one he published. But you also have the manuscript, because the Kere is one of the 4 lectures that Heidegger gave in 1949. It's the first lecture series he did, Einblick in das was ist, in Bremen. And you have that version. And if you look at the manuscript, Heidegger is making this distinction between Sein with Y and Sein with epsilon. But in the published version, he doesn't do it. And Jäger said that there are only 2 minor changes, but if you look at it and go through it, then you can see there's a lot of changes. So we list all the changes. You can find what is in the manuscript, you can find what is in the typoscript of the manuscript, what is in the Gesamtausgabe edition, and what is in our edition. So you have the overview, and you can track everything. If we refer also to the differences between the Gesamtausgabe and the first edition and our edition, so you can really see and use it to follow these things. If you look at volume 16 was meant by Heidegger as a collection of all the texts that were still left outside of the first 15 volumes. So you would have Hebel, that's already the other one, but you would have Gelassenheit would be an example that would be in this volume. But Hermann Heidegger decided to put all this stuff from the rectoral period in it, which in itself is a problem, because Heidegger himself never wanted that to be part of the Gesamtausgabe. And at the same time, if you put it out without any commentary, I think this is not the way to do it. They should have published it outside of the Gesamtausgabe and say we have a volume or 2 volumes of all this material, and we could have had a third volume with a commentary and essays and published it there. Because when we did the Heidegger Jahrbuch, the documents on the directorial period, we found a lot of letters and things that are not in the Gesamtausgabe. So that's one of the problems, I think. And it's the same if you leave out the original pagination. It's very disheartening to find the right page. So it's much more practical if you have the original pagination. With the kleinere schrift, if you would number the pages without indicating the first edition page numbers, and then you get lost. So that's basically what we try to do with this. And I think you could do it with the Nietzsche volumes as well. I think it would be worthwhile. But I don't think that we would need to sell a lot of volumes before the publishing house will do it. But of course, the most important example is Being in Time. I think you should do a critical edition of Being in Time, in the sense of indicating the changes over the different editions, which is you may quote something from the 6th edition which is not in the 7th edition. So there is no standard text, basically. Even in the Gesamtausgabe, text of Being in Time is still different from the editions that Niemeyer did, although they're supposed to be the same. And you could include all the marginalia from the different copies Heidegger had of Being in Time. This is only from the 2nd edition, Hütten exemplar. That's why there are so few. You would expect a lot more. And at the same time, you could check all the citations and then try to solve the unmarked quotations that you find in Being in Time, so it would be a worthwhile project. But then it's always the question who's going to pay for it and who's going to do it, because that would be a huge project. If you could go back, the manuscript is still there, so you could say, well, this is the text of the manuscript, and these are the changes over the 15 editions since. But it's choices. What they do in the Gesamtausgabe is mix the notes of students from a lecture course with the manuscript. So it's hard to tell which is which. They changed the principle in the volumes of the seminar, Heidegger seminars, where they bring the text by Heidegger. You can see it now for example, in the Zollikoon seminars. You have in the Gesamtausgabe with all the preparatory work Heidegger did and in his own handwriting, and then you have the seminars as they were recorded by Bos, so you can compare. You can do the same as other seminar volumes. We have Heidegger's manuscript and then the Seminarbuch with the interpretation of the students of the course, and sometimes you can see that, of course, there were things they discussed that are not in Heidegger's notes. So I think it would be a worthwhile project as well to open up to do an internet publication of all these student manuscripts of the different courses, and basically you should redo the Gesamtausgabe and do it in the same way. Say, well, this is just Heidegger's text. And of course, it's also a matter of money, so it's not going to happen. But you could do it with say, well, these manuscripts by the students will make available on the internet. So you have people can work with them. That's one of the problems, of course, if you can't read Heidegger's handwriting, there's not much point in going to Marbach, because you can't work with the manuscript. That's why you need people who do that. And at the moment, there may be 10 people left who can do it. It will be less rather than more. So it's also a way of keeping things alive. It's also a reason that I decided I should do some of it, or at least be able to read his handwriting. But it's not so easy.